Working less is an act of resistance. And contrary to our inherited Protestant work ethic, the Bible actually commands that we rest, because our purpose in life is not to be productive. It's to create a world with less work and more neighbors. I want to talk about how some of the earliest literature from the Bible is a subversive attack on the idolatry of empire, and how they imagined an alternative community of abundance instead of scarcity and competition. In Walter Brueggemann's little profound book, Sabbath as Resistance, he says that Pharaoh always needs more bricks. He uses the Exodus story to explain that what empires really worship isn't God or kings, it's productivity itself for the sake of productivity. His central thesis in pretty much all of his books is this one idea: empire creates a world of false scarcity and competition, and everyone exists to make the empire more productive. That's everyone's purpose in life, according to empire. However, the work of the prophets like Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Jesus is to present an alternative, a community founded on abundance, shared resources, and love. So it would be helpful to define how I'm using the term empire, like capital E empire. An empire, lowercase e empire, is a polity or a state, political unit that has conquered or absorbed people groups beyond those of its initial cultural identities. There is usually not a specific moment that kingdoms or nations become empires. Sometimes it's recognized in names and titles before or long after meeting the criteria for it. Think about the Roman Republic and the US as examples of this. They both ostensibly claim to be one democratic nation, or Republican nation, but they have territories all over the world. They've been expanding ever since their founding. It's just simply still a public relations liability to openly name it as an empire until Caesar Augustus becomes emperor, or whoever our emperor is going to be. There's still like this plausible deniability or denial that we are an empire, but come on now. It's safe to say that empires are typically ethnically diverse as they expand to absorb more peoples and places, and access to those peoples and places, labors, and resources are integrated into the project of expanding the empire. The first empire was founded when Sargon of Akkad conquered other city-states or in Mesopotamia, remember Sumeria. Sargon of Akkad expanded his rule beyond his home of Akkad to the Persian Gulf in the east, all the way to the Mediterranean in the west, and if you pay attention to history, especially ancient history like Bronze Age history, Iron Age history, these guys, empires come and go, but they all want to be Sargon of Akkad. Like, he's kind of like Rome to us, you know? It's kind of interesting. But this is why empire's true idol is productivity. It is an insatiable need for growth and expansion. Emperors are glorified for their competency at expanding the empire to enrich the imperial core with surplus labor and resources. Sometimes cooperative peoples can be rewarded by sharing in the economic prosperity of the empire if they are loyal to the empire and are productive and serve the empire. But those who resist the homogenization of empire don't always fare so well. But it's a runaway feedback loop, where the acquisition of more peoples and resources reinforces the acquisition of more peoples and resources. The cult of personality required to sustain an otherwise irrational loyalty to the emperor demands projects beyond feeding the people and building public infrastructure. Although in every place except my country, you are determined to be a good or bad emperor based on your building infrastructure stuff for the people. We don't, for some reason, expect that of our emperors, but whatever. They require monuments, they require standing armies, they require bureaucracies. The pyramids themselves are physical manifestations of the empire. A 6 million ton monument built brick by workers for the glorification of one man. This is a massive waste of resources for no reason other than the ego and ambitions of the empire. That's part of it, right? It's showing off. Like, I have so much resources and power and people that I built this 6 million ton tomb for myself, because I can, you know. That's part of it. Wasting the resources is part of it. Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament theologian, and he describes how the people of Israel were among the resistors to empire. According to the text, they were slaves in Egypt sometime during the Late Bronze Age. It's important to note that we have no archaeological, material, or textual evidence outside of the Bible for Israelis being in Egypt or migrating from Egypt to Canaan. However, we do know that Egypt controlled Canaan at this time, at the end of the Bronze Age. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that this was a mythologized but nevertheless real tradition of resistance to the Egyptian empire. Whether the people were physically present in Egypt or simply interacting with an expansionist empire from the Nile Valley, their experience would have been the same: a foreign ruler who is forcibly extracting labor and resources to fund his imperial project. In this case, when the Hebrews resist their subjugation, they are met with more violence and exploitation. According to the text in Exodus 5, Moses and Aaron ask Pharaoh for permission to take a break from their work to worship their God, Yahweh. Listen to the exchange and see if you can hear any parallels from how people talk about workers in today's world with how Pharaoh talks about workers in the 13th century BC. Also, when you're reading the Bible, whenever you see the word Lord in all caps, that's a way of translating God's name, Yahweh. So I've replaced Lord with Yahweh, just to get a sense of like why Pharaoh hasn't heard of the Lord or God, you know? Okay. So Pharaoh said, "Who is this Yahweh that I should obey and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go." Then Moses and Aaron said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to Yahweh our God, or he may strike us with plagues and the sword." But the king of Egypt, listen to what Pharaoh said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working." He sounds like Elon Musk or like your manager at work. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people: "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out. Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies." And the slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, "Complete the work required of you each day, just as when you had straw." And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers that they had appointed, demanding, "Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before?" Okay. Their reward for resistance is not freedom or rights, it's higher quotas for the empire. As Walter Brueggemann says so succinctly, Pharaoh needs more bricks. Pharaoh always needs more bricks. It's also important to note that this Pharaoh in the story is never named, because it's not just Ramesses II or whichever Pharaoh would have happened to be alive at this time. This is not a story about one evil man. This is a story about empire as an institution. Of course, in today's world, it doesn't matter who the president is or even which country you live in. It doesn't matter if you live in the United States or China. Global capital demands more bricks. It doesn't care about the people making them. It doesn't even care if the bricks are necessary for human flourishing. If the bricks don't get sold on Amazon, they're destroyed. They're just destroyed to maintain the lie of artificial scarcity. Pharaoh simply needs more bricks. So you can see how the people of Israel and people everywhere need an alternative vision in our communities and economies. In Moses' vision, what Brueggemann calls the alternative community of Moses, or what Jesus called the kingdom of God, labor and resources aren't an end unto themselves. They are a means to provide for the flourishing of our communities. If we are mindful and generous with our labor and resources, we can live lives of abundance and as neighbors, rather than producers and consumers. Neighbors don't exploit each other. They don't charge interest. Neighbors don't hoard housing and extract artificially inflated rents. They don't profit off the surplus labor of their neighbors. Neighbors don't use neighbors as a source of economic growth at any cost. Let's look at some examples of how a community like this might work. In Deuteronomy, the law of Moses instructs the people to not harvest the edges of their fields and to not pick up anything that they happen to drop in the harvesting. The remaining crops serve as a proto-welfare system for those in the community in need of food assistance. The law also commands that every 7 years, debts are to be completely forgiven, and every 50 years, the year of Jubilee, lands are to return to the families that may have been forced to sell them. I've made a video before about penny auctions in the Great Depression, when people would show up to an auction when their neighbor's farm was foreclosed on. The community would show up to the auction and intimidate the bidders and bid 1 penny, 2 pennies, 3 pennies, and win the land back for their neighbor. But imagine if you lived in a country where if you had to sell everything you had, it was returned to your family sometime in the next 50 years. So your family, it's not a generational problem. Entire generations of people and entire families can't be taken advantage of. There were specific cities of refuge established for anyone who may have accidentally committed a crime, like manslaughter. Like manslaughter is when you accidentally kill somebody, not homicide. They would go to these cities of refuge to be protected from reprisals. This kind of sounds like sanctuary cities, a city where you are safe from if you committed a crime or don't have the right paperwork. Okay, the law even instructs specifically to remember the foreigner and the widow, for you yourselves were foreigners in the land of Egypt. This is the core, absolute heart of Judeo-Christian tradition, that you remember the foreigner, you remember the migrant, you remember the person who's out of place and doesn't feel like they belong, because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt and you were saved by Yahweh. This is a community that has experienced injustice and is committed to empathy and justice for anyone else who may be vulnerable members of the community. Pretty much all of the examples that I mentioned are illustrated in the story of Ruth. She was a foreign widow who relied on grain left from the harvest for food. Her next of kin, Boaz, used the provisions of the law to redeem her late husband's land back to her. Because remember, she's not even Jewish. She's not even from Israel. She's a Moabite. Her husband was from Israel, and Boaz redeemed the land through the provisions made in this law back to Ruth, who's not even an Israelite, but she's Boaz's family, or she's her husband's family. She's now in the family. This is an incredible example to me in an ancient, brutal world of how a community is meant to value human dignity and community more than production and profit and growth. This is why Walter Brueggemann says the relationship, he says this in Truth Speaks to Power, I made another video about it. Walter Brueggemann says the relationship between creditors and debtors as neighbors is more important than the economic realities under consideration. I don't know about you, but JP Morgan Chase has never considered my inherent dignity as a person or my relationship as a neighbor more important than the 29.99 interest I owe them. We have this all fucked up. The Bible is complicated, and you could spend a lifetime exploring the origins and themes of these stories. But Brueggemann illustrates how at its core, this is a story about smashing the idols not of Baal and Asherah and Ra or Pharaoh, but the idol of productivity. The Sabbath, intentional rest from productivity, is an act of resistance. A better world is possible. We are not merely economic resources, a means to the end of imperial expansion. We are people made in the image of God. We are not here to work, we are here to create. Creation isn't productive. It's how we imagine a better world. Sometimes creation has no purpose at all other than to declare to the universe that we exist and to imagine a community where we live as neighbors, not as consumers or producers or bosses or employees or independent contractors or debtors or creditors or landlords or tenants, but as neighbors. Pharaoh does not need any more bricks.